California True Crime is a podcast that sometimes deals with heinous acts of violence towards other individuals. This podcast may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to another episode of California True Crime. I'm your host, Sean. With me tonight is Charles. How are you?
Excellent. How are you, Sean?
I'm doing good tonight. It's a good night. For tonight's episode, we'll be talking about a 1981 unsolved quadruple homicide, better known as the Keddie Murders. And this took place in cabin 28 of the Keddie Resort on April 11th, 1981. It might actually be April 12th. It matters on if the murders happened at night on the 11th or in the early morning of April 12th. When I first started looking at this case, I didn't know where Keddie was. So Keddie is Northern California and it's in Plumas County. If you were in Keddie, about an hour and a half to the west would be Chico, and an hour and a half east would be Reno. So that gives you a little bit of where it is. And it's a really small town. It's maybe roughly 100, and it fluctuates. And the closest town to it is Quincy, which isn't much bigger. It's roughly around 2,000 people. And Charles and I, we live in a pretty small town, but I mean, this just seems really small. There's probably nothing around besides that.
I don't think small towns in Northern California, I think, are a norm, but Keddie is a exceptionally small town.
Right, yeah. It seems like they're secluded from a lot of everything. And especially in the 80s, you probably didn't have the internet and everything like that you were probably your own people at that time.
Also, I think Keddie does not actually qualify as a incorporated town.
Yeah.
It would be classified as, in California, as unincorporated county land.
Oh,
so
okay.
They don't even rate their own police force or
right.
mayor.
Yeah, it's pretty small. So the name Keddie comes from a man named Arthur Walter Keddie, who was also considered the father of the Western Pacific Railroad. He was a railroad surveyor, and he was the one that came up with the Keddie Y. And it's these two bridges. One goes over a river, and the other one actually goes through a mountain. It's a tunnel dug out through a mountain. And this was built for a route from San Francisco to Salt Lake City as an alternative route to the Southern Pacific route, which went over the Donner Pass. And from the Keddie Y and the Donner Pass one, it's a 2,000-foot elevation difference.
Started in the 1940s, Keddie went from being a railhead in Northern California to a resort town where people would vacation. There was even a ski hill right in the middle of it, actually. In the 1960s, the rates on the cabins varied between $40 and $90 a night, depending on what cabin you wanted. A lot of this has to do with the fact that it is in Northern California, kind of secluded, and a lot of people were coming up to get away from the hustle and bustle of cities, including as far away as Hollywood and LA area.
So then in the 1970s, the train depot that would stop and drop off all the people who were vacationing actually closed, and it wasn't that resort town that it used to be. Not as many people came anymore. So they had to adjust to make it work still. So in the 1980s, the owner, Gary Maleth, he changed the resort to low-income cabins for people who just needed a home, and that roughly cost around $150 to $300 a month. It mattered on the size of the cabin. So that was a little background on Keddie. I think now we should probably get to some background on the victims. And we're going to talk about the Sharpe family. There was 6 people living in cabin 28, which consisted of Glenna Sue Sharpe, who was 36. I'm just going to refer to her as Sue. It's kind of a interesting thing. I don't know I've never heard the name Glenna before this. Have you,
No.
Charles? Yeah, and so she went by Sue because her best friend's name was also Glenna, which it kind of boggles my mind that
And her best friend was also her neighbor, correct?
yes, yes,
So two people with the first name Glenna living in Keddie, Northern
with a
California.
population of less than 100, yes. So it's pretty interesting. And then her oldest son was Johnny Sharpe, who was 15, Sheila Sharpe, who was 14, Tina Sharpe, who's 12, Rick Sharpe, 10, and Greg Sharpe, 5. So they all lived in this pretty small cabin, all six of them. Before they moved to Keddie, the family lived in Connecticut with her husband, James. And it's been said that it was an abusive relationship. And in 1979, James kicked the whole family out of the house. Sheila stated many years later that her father was actually sexually abusing her and her sister. So Sue and the children made their way across the country. They stopped in Missouri for a couple weeks and visited her mother-in-law. And then shortly after that, they made their way all the way to Quincy and they rented a trailer that her brother lived in. So they moved across country because she had family here. So, and in November of 1980, they moved from the trailer and started renting cabin 28 at the resort. From pictures that I've seen on Keddie 28, it's a website that has a lot of information on this. It seems pretty small for six people to live in. The ceilings seem pretty low, and it was the late 70s, early 80s, the flowery wallpaper everywhere that was matched with the wood paneling that you would see. And when you walk in the front door, you're in the living room, and it was pretty much like a typical 80s living room. I looking at the pictures, I felt like it had resembled some of the house I grew up in, and you just have like the darker carpet, and you have like a TV, the old box TV, and one of those plaid, yellow and brownish plaid couches that everyone seemed to own at the time. And you had some TV trays next to it to watch TV while you eat. And on the wall, there was like pictures of the kids. So it seemed like a typical little home for that they were living in.
These are converted vacation cabins,
Right.
too. So I think looking at those pictures, you do get a sense of, like you said, it is small for a family that big.
Right.
But it seems like that there was a lot more. It was a family environment.
Mm-hmm.
That there were other families in the area the kids played with, and friends, her best friend living next door.
Right. Seemed to be a lot of kids around, and everyone seemed to be nice and friendly to each other. So if you're standing in the living room at the front door and you walk through the living room, to the right is a hallway, and it has the boys' room and the girls' room, and in between the two rooms is a bathroom. If you didn't enter the hallway, you would keep walking and you would enter the kitchen. Now, off the back of the kitchen is the back door and stairs going down. And if you went down the stairs, there's a basement that you can only enter from the outside. And half of it was like the laundry room, but the other half is where Johnny was staying. He was the oldest boy, so probably just needed his own room. And he lived in one half of the basement. If that layout was kind of hard to follow, we'll have a picture of it on our website, californiatruecrime.com, and you can check it out for yourself. So now this is where like things kind of get confusing because there were so many eyewitness accounts. There's just so many things that are conflicting, but I'm going to try to give you the best timeline that I can, and hopefully it's understandable because it's just a lot of things are very strange at this point. And it's just hard because like you've got these small towns who are, they're always good friends and everything like that. But when something weird happens, all of a sudden there's just this gossip that happens and you just don't really know what's real, what's not. People trying to interject themselves to just be part of it.
Well, it's a case. It's unsolved. There are a lot of peculiar things about it, and like you said, small towns. Us both being from our small town, we know how people gossip, and how little things that aren't necessarily connected then take on kind of a conspiratorial view, and everyone's looking for connections, and especially with an act like this where it is such a senseless crime that that kind of defies logic for people.
Yeah. So to start this timeline, at approximately 1:30 p.m., Dana Wingate, who is Johnny's best friend, Dana's 17, and Johnny, they are in Keddie and they're putting on matching purple jogging suits with white stripes, and they have matching headbands to hitchhike into Quincy, which I just have to say, to me, this is amazing. They're kids in high school. They're going to take on a Saturday afternoon in Keddie, hitchhiking, wearing matching outfits. It's amazing to me because, I mean, I think all of us we were young. We just thought we were amazing, and matching outfits would really help.
Purple jumpsuits is a typical 15-year-old mentality. You could see those in the store and say, yes, I am going to rock that when I walk down the street.
At the same time this was happening, Sue was inside watching TV at Cabin 28. Sheila was outside talking to her friend, and Tina is hanging out at the Seabolts. Now, the Seabolts were family friends, and they lived in Cabin 27. Little fact, back in the 60s, Cabin 27 was actually Keddie's post office. Justin and Greg meet up a little earlier, and they're out riding bikes. It's a Saturday in Keddie, 1981. Seems like what everyone was doing, like normal kid kind of things. Even Sue just watching TV. It was Saturday afternoon. So around 5 p.m., Sue, Ricky, Greg, and Justin are in Cabin 28, and they're eating burritos for dinner. And Sheila leaves to go stay the night at the Seabolts. It looks like Johnny and Dana had hung out in Quincy all day and went to the foster home that Dana lived in. Here they changed clothes from their matching outfits, and it said that Dana switches shoes with one of the other foster kids. They made their way to someone's house who was going to give them a ride to Keddie. That ride fell through because the girl that was going to give them a ride, her mom wanted her home for dinner, so Dana and Johnny just decided to hitchhike. Also on that note, in the documentary that you can watch on YouTube of the Keddie Murders, Dana's foster father said that they needed to find a ride to get to Keddie, which it seemed like they did, but it fell through. And the foster dad said absolutely no hitchhiking, but they didn't. They decided to just hitchhike instead. At about 8:30, Greg goes to bed and he sleeps on the bottom bunk. In the boys' room, there was bunk beds, and then there was a cot against the wall. At about 9 p.m., Sheila stops by home, gets some night clothes, and heads back over to the Seabolts house. Tina also headed back from the Seabolts after watching Barbara Mandrell and the Mandrell sisters on TV. This was like a variety show that had a lot of big singers, country stars, kind of like Hee Haw, I guess.
Yeah, it's like a holdover from the variety shows of the mid-70s, early 80s.
Right. And that night, there wasn't a new episode on, and it wasn't a rerun, but it said it was the best of. So going by how long the show has been on, I'm assuming that Tina would have watched performances by Dolly Parton, Bobby Vinton, and Conway Twitty were some of the big names. People at this time see Dana and Johnny hitchhiking. There was a lot of sightings. It was hard to kind of figure that out. It's a little after 9, and Sue's in her night clothes and sitting down watching The Love Boat. The episode that she was watching that night, the synopsis of it was Captain Stubing's friend, who is a gambler, becomes a bad influence on Vicky. And old-time members of a gang reunite to rob the ship's vault. Ricky and Justin go to bed around 10 after watching the show, and they go in the same room where Greg is already sleeping. Justin sleeps on the top bunk, and Ricky sleeps on the cot. Everyone seems to go to bed at the Seabolts around 11 p.m. There are eyewitness accounts that Dana and Johnny are still hitchhiking at this time. From here, it's hard to say what happened next or how. We have so many witnesses saying things, or cats acting weird, dogs not barking, porch lights on and off of houses. It just seemed like everyone was on high alert, even though they weren't. It's things that they said after it happened, kind of stuff. And
one of those things that after something happens, everybody tries to go back and think, like, did I hear something?
Right.
Every little creak or groan or anything, trying to maybe magnify it to it being the missing piece that would make sense of all of this. When in reality, I mean, it's a tip, like you said earlier, it's a typical Saturday night.
Yeah.
You watch TV, you hang out, I mean, how many of us remember exactly everything we did on a typical
Right.
Monday and Saturday night?
Yeah. So on April 12th, 1981, Sheila, who was staying the night at cabin 27 at the Seabolts, went home to get a change of clothes. She was going to go to church with the Seabolts. At 7:45, she walked back to her cabin, which is approximately 15 feet from each cabin. So you have the Seabolts front door at cabin 27, and you have cabin 28's front door, and it's really like 15 feet away. You can see in some of the pictures on the Keddie 28 site, there's no space. All these cabins were just on top of each other. So she opens the front door, and what she sees is bloody bodies on the ground, and one is covered with a blanket. She also saw what she thought was a pocket knife on the floor. She ran back to the Seabolts immediately and told them what she saw, and then Zonita Seabolt, the mother, ran to cabin 25, which is like across the, I don't know, is it a dirt road? Is it?
No, I think from the pictures that it is like a semi-paved road,
Okay.
like it's asphalt. It's not like a public road, but again, it's like more like a trailer park road.
Yeah. So she ran across that to cabin 25 where there was a working phone, because I guess the Seabolts didn't have a phone, and cabin 28 had a phone, but obviously they're not going to run back in there. So they call the police from cabin 25. They get back over to the Seabolts, and Jamie Seabolt, the older brother, the oldest son, however you want to say it, he goes over to cabin 28 and he knocks on the boys' window because they didn't know. Sheila only saw the people in the front, and they didn't know who was alive and what was going on there. So Jamie goes over to the boys' window and he knocks on the window. The boys come to the window, and they were able to get Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin, who was staying the night, out of the window safely. After this, Jamie, he went through the back door of cabin 28 to look for any more survivors, and he found no one else in the house alive or just anyone. Now, on this morning, if you enter the front door, you'll see 3 bodies laying on the floor of the living room. Closest to the front door is Johnny Sharpe. He is lying on his back with his hands bound with white cloth medical tape. And when we were researching this, Charles and I couldn't really figure out what it actually was. And you know what it is.
Well, medical tape, we have it in first aid kits. If you play sports, you use it to tape up sprained ankles or knees. It's that white cloth tape. It rips easily. You use it for anything, but it is an odd choice to bind somebody's hands with. But
Definitely.
It is something you might have laying around the house in a first aid kit, or for sprained ankles, or cuts and bruises.
His feet were also bound with white extension cord. This electrical cord was stretched and looped around Johnny's best friend's feet, Dana, who was staying the night with him, the one that was hitchhiking with him. And Dana was face down on the ground with his head resting on a couch cushion that had been removed from the couch, and it was on the ground. He had tape on both of his boots, but the tape had been broken, so his legs were not bound. Also, the tape around his wrist had been broken, so unless it was cut, he broke free.
Like it broke free, and then
Yeah.
they used or whoever did this then used like an electrical cord to tie them up so they wouldn't.
Right, yeah. Next to Dana and Johnny was Sue, and she was covered in a blanket. She also had tape around her wrists and ankles, and on top of the tape was an electrical cord wrapped tightly and knotted. She also had another electrical cord that went down from her to her feet in a way like someone being hogtied, but not behind the back and front.
So her hands were tied together, but then they were also connected to tying to her ankles.
Yeah, and
Okay.
and if you had it hogtied, your
It would be
knees
behind
would be
your
able
back.
to bend and
exactly.
everything
You'd be
like that.
behind your
Yeah.
back.
There was also a gag in her mouth, and it consisted of her own panties that she was wearing and a blue bandana, and then there was tape on top of that. So Sue had been stabbed to death. She had cuts and bruises on her face, stabs all over her body, and some of her teeth had even been fractured. Johnny was beaten and was also stabbed in the throat. He had multiple skull fractures also. Dana had many injuries to the left side of his face and the back of the head, like he'd gotten beat up pretty bad, but his death was actually ruled a strangulation. At the scene, They seemed to find a lot of evidence, the police did. They found a bloody butcher knife, a clawfoot hammer, and what Sheila thought was that pocket knife on the ground was actually a steak knife that they say the murderers used such force it bent backwards while they were doing it. The phone was taken off the hook, and there's just reports that there were little tiny stab marks all on the wall of the house, but I couldn't find anywhere that they were fresh or like that they said that there was blood in them or anything like that. Because you got two kids who got matching suits to take on the day. They could have been practicing throwing knives in the house if it was before. I mean, it just felt like it wasn't. It was in so many reports, I think, just to make the scene more gruesome.
It was evidence that something happened, but it wasn't necessarily that people that did this crime stabbed the walls.
Right.
There were holes.
But they would say, like in the reports, multiple stab wounds in the walls. But I don't even know if they ever said that it was evident that it happened that night. Now, with the discovery of the bodies, there's police in and out of the house all the time, taking photos of the crime scene, trying to gather as much evidence as possible. But it was said that it took a couple hours for them or anyone to actually realize that Tina was missing. She wasn't around. No one had seen her except Justin, a 12-year-old who stayed the night over there, was actually trying to tell people that Tina was missing. But either it was just lost or no one was listening to him. Or
I can imagine that they're at that moment, probably the police and other people were not placating him, but it's a hysterical child. There's a ton of other stuff going on. But I imagine, given the fact that it's a very small place and that there are police and there would be neighbors everywhere, I have a hard time still believing that none of the other neighbors would mention the fact that Tina is not there.
Right. Yeah. And it's small town. Everyone's coming out to see the hubbub, and then at the same time, you got to think like the sheriff's department from Quincy probably has never really dealt with anything like this. So once it was known that Tina was missing, there was an extensive search that went out from the sheriff's department. They did flyers up everywhere, and the FBI was called in, and no one could find her. They did the whole where everyone helps out and goes through the woods and stuff like that you would see. It wasn't until 3 years later that Tina was actually found. While a man was searching for bottles in an area known as Camp 18, which is about roughly 30 miles away from Keddie, he came across part of a skull. And several months after this, an anonymous call came into Butte County Sheriff's Office that the skull belonged to Tina Sharpe and that they should do another search out there.
So when this skull was found, then authorities that I imagine that he turned it into had no idea who it was for.
At first, what I saw was that he took it to a pathologist. Mm-hmm. Is that, and he was kind of hoping, I think, that it was ancient or
like native Californian,
right? Yeah, just maybe
something historical.
Right. He's out there searching for bottles. Maybe he thought he'd come across some money by finding something, and that's when the pathologist said, "No, it hasn't been there this long, and it's a 12-year-old." One interesting thing when he was talking about it, that hadn't been there that long. Tina had been missing for 3 years, and he had told people that it would have been out there maybe 2 years tops because of the bleaching on one side, and the other side was pretty nicely kept.
So the skull was of a 12-year-old, but it was only 2 years old. It had been out in the weather for 2 years.
Well, that's what he thought at first,
right.
And
okay.
then everyone was like, "How can that be?" kind of thing. But after inspecting it more, they found that it probably had been out there from the time of the actual murder.
Almost right after.
Yeah. So after they got that call, the anonymous call about saying it was Tina and to go look again, they found more bones. And with all the bones that they did find, they were not able to figure out how she actually died. There was no trauma to anything, and so they were never able to figure out. Now that you know about the Keddie murders, this is an unsolved murder, but there were two main suspects. They were never sent to prison. They never went to trial.
Officially charged.
Never officially charged.
They weren't arrested.
Yeah. So They were two main suspects, and I'd like to talk about them. One of them is not her husband. We should get that out. Her husband was still on the East Coast and has solid alibis that he was not even close to being around California at the time. The police did interview two suspects, and they kind of give a timeline of that from 11 p.m. until Sheila finds him in the morning. Their own story, but it does. We can say it fills in the gaps a little of what went on that night. So, for a little background of these suspects, we'll start with Martin Smart, who also went by Marty. He lived at cabin 26, and it was very close to cabin 28. He lived there with his wife Marilyn and his stepson Justin, and Justin was actually the child that was sleeping over that night.
The boy's friend that was in the back room.
Right, yeah, he was in the boys' room and got out of the window. There's also a younger son, but I can't really tell if it's Martin's son or another stepson of Marilyn's, and they don't really mention him that much. Another person living with Martin at cabin 26 at the time was Severin John Bo Bobade, who just went by Bo. With a name like that, pick something shorter. And they both met at a VA hospital in Reno. We know that Marty was in and out of the VA hospital all the time for many different things. Marty was in the Vietnam War. He was a cook and supposedly never saw any action or was never on the front line. He tried to claim PTSD, and the psychiatrist used him just being a cook in the Vietnam War, saying that wouldn't cut it. And I know it was the 80s, but I just feel like if you're going to go to war, no matter what you do over there, it's a different environment. You might see things no matter what, and you might have some PTSD. And
downplaying just because of his job or
Right.
where he was in relation to combat doesn't mean it wasn't a traumatic environment.
Right. Yeah. So after getting to know Bo at the VA hospital, Bo comes to his house to live with him for a while. I guess they had some. They were talking about getting a business together and moving to Oregon and stuff like that. They had some ideas of what they were going to do, and this was about 3 weeks before the murder. Now the police interviewed both Marty and Bo a couple days after the murder. I'm not sure if there was any particular reason why they interviewed him. I think they were interviewing a lot of people around there, and also Justin was staying the night, and he lives at the house, so it could be just that. So first we'll talk about how their night played out from their interviews, and then we'll get into other things why they're the main suspects. On the night of the murders, at around 10 p.m., Bo, Marty, and Marilyn head to the backdoor bar, which is in the resort. It's a bar connected to like the main building of the resort, and it's just a bar. Marty and Bo both dressed up in three-piece suits that night for a small bar, but it's said that they were looking for maybe a companion friend for Bo. From 10 until 1, they hung out and just did typical bar stuff. And at 1 a.m., the wife of the owner of the bar came in to the back door. She changed the music from country to rock and roll, and this supposedly upset Bo and Marty, and they decided to leave. I guess it upset them so much that when the three of them got back to the house, Marty even called and complained to the bartender or owner who was there, and like 2-3 minutes away, and then he just called and complained right back. He said that the owner apologized and they decided to go back for a nightcap. Marilyn decided to stay home at this time. So, and they kind of changed clothes a little and then went back, had a drink, and then came back like last call. So probably in between 1:45, 2:15, if it was like one of the later bars that don't really regulate that in the first place. After they returned back to the cabin, they said that they went to bed after a short time. At 3 a.m., Marty did wake up. He says that he wakes up that around that time every night to stoke the fire. And he said Bo was sleeping on the couch. He even opened the front door to grab a log. And what he said was, with all these times walking back and forth from the bar and opening the door, he heard nothing unusual of the night. And he even said that he didn't even hear the train, which usually goes by then. I'm not really sure what that has anything to do with it. Like, was the train just not running, or he was just mentioning that there was no train? So the moon phase on that night of April 11th was in the first quarter, which only gives visibility about like a half of a moon. And the weather was fairly nice that day, so it probably didn't like have fog. It was mid 60s, and the lowest temperature that I got to that night was 43 degrees. So I understand that there's huge trees and everything like that, so the moon probably doesn't make a difference in the first place, but it was probably pretty dark. You can't really see anything.
Right, and this being their local bar, they would be used to going back and forth. So even if they couldn't see anything, you would expect them to hear something out of the ordinary or just notice something out of the ordinary.
Right.
They're used to going back and forth at the bar so much that they're okay calling the owner and complaining about the type of music. So I would expect if something was out of the ordinary, these guys would know about it right
Right.
away. The close proximity between the cabins, and if this bar is on the same premises, it's not like they're walking. If they went back at home at 1 o'clock and still got back in time for last call, it's not very far away.
Right.
So anything out of the ordinary, I would expect these guys to see or hear.
Yeah. So with all that, there was actually like no real physical evidence linking Marty and Bo to the crime. There just seemed to be a lot of weird things. I'll try to run through the stuff, but at the same time, I'm not saying that these are the men. The police did not arrest these men, and they, that I'm not the police department either. They just seem to be a lot of odd things that make people believe that these two men were involved somehow. While reading the transcripts from both Marty and Bo's police interview, there was some inconsistencies that occurred. One being how many people were in the bar that night. Marty said there was about 30 to 35 people throughout the night, while Bo said that there was only about 7 or 8. I mean, if you're not paying attention, like it's 2 days after, I mean, you might not be paying attention, but that's a big difference.
That's a big difference to go between 35 people and 7 or 8 in a bar that is in a converted campground.
Right.
Yeah. So
yeah, it is a big difference. Another thing is that Marty said that Marilyn was asleep when they got back after their nightcap, but Bo said that she was still awake. Also, just when they were interviewing him out of the blue, Marty just tells the detectives that his hammer was gone. I guess they found one hammer at the scene, but the police thought that there might have been another hammer involved. And he talked about that he leaves his hammer on the front porch, and it was just missing one day. So he just it wasn't coaxed. It wasn't
out of the blue.
Yeah, it was.
Oh, by the way, my hammer is missing.
It was nothing was talked about a hammer, and he just brought that up.
And the boys and Sue were both subjected to a vicious beating.
Right.
Did the medical examiner, was it conclusive that it was done from a hammer, or was it? Yeah,
they're pretty sure that it was they found that one claw hammer there,
right.
But there was reports that another hammer was also involved. But they're pretty sure that it was the hammer.
Okay.
One more thing in Marty's interview that was extremely interesting was the detective started asking Marty if Justin might have seen anything that night while he stayed the night there. Marty starts talking about how Justin is a light sleeper at home, and when sometimes he wakes up to stoke the fire, it kind of wakes up Justin, and Justin goes and uses the bathroom and stuff. But in the police report, he goes on and says, quote, "There's a very high possibility that he could have been awake or alerted to something unusual in the house. And he is quiet enough to where he could have noticed something without me detecting him." So
that's a slip, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's either putting himself in the murder site, or he's just slipping and thinking of Justin getting up to use the bathroom.
Yeah, when
something
he's
like
stoking
that.
the fire.
Yeah, so it was a very interesting thing that. And it didn't seem like the police just let it, and they just asked another question. And then there's even some more weird things with Bo's interview. During the initial interview, Bo said that he had worked as a Chicago police officer for 18 years, but retired after being shot while in the line of duty in 1958. So, what I can see from his death certificate is that Bo was born in 1931, which means he became a Chicago police officer when he was 9. But the police didn't seem to do anything about that one.
Do you think that might have to do with his history in the VA hospital and being treated
Oh, that could be it.
possible
I didn't even
for,
think about that.
PTSD? I mean, if it's an odd occurrence, but if they were interviewing him and they knew already going in that he was being treated for something before, but it still, to me, it would still be important to call him on the fact,
Right.
or corroborate that in some
Well,
way.
the one weird thing is that they never re-interviewed them, I guess.
So it's just the one interview.
Yeah. Another interesting thing he said was that Marilyn was his niece, which there's no relation at all. He met Marty at the VA hospital, so it wasn't his niece. Marilyn also was interviewed, and she told police that all 3 of them stopped by Sue's house to ask if Sue wanted to go to the bar that night. But in Bo's interview, he said that he's never met Sue and had no idea where she lived. Marilyn also told police that while they were at the bar that night, she overheard Bo say to Marty that he felt like killing someone. Marilyn also said that Marty tried to run her and Justin over with a car in another interview or the documentary. But she says a lot of these things about
that he was a scary person. Is that was that those occur after this, or was he already prone to violence before?
I haven't seen any reports that this was before the murders. This is stuff that Marilyn said afterwards. So I don't know if there's like actual police reports of her saying these things.
Right.
So,
which doesn't mean that they're not true.
No,
I mean,
exactly.
A lot of times people in abusive relationships aren't going to necessarily report those.
Right.
But if it is, assuming that they are true, then that's already sets up a pattern either before or after that. The person's really violent,
right.
And then coupled with the idea that Bo is either not telling him the truth or is not connecting reality with his perception.
Right. But Bo also was he had an arrest record from in like Chicago and stuff for armed robbery. So armed robbery is
violent.
Violent. So he might have that. So
right.
Also the day after April 12th, Marilyn and her son moved out of the house. So I don't know if it had anything to do with the murders, if she was already planning it. It just happened to be the day, but she moved out that day when all the cops showed up.
I can understand that. I mean, Justin, having gone through that,
right?
Even assuming he was able to, if he slept through it, regardless, as a mother or as a parent, I would want to make sure that my son is not confronted with that environment every day. Maybe try to get them out. And where their cabin is in 26, it's really across the road. You'd have to wake up every morning and see this place where this terrible thing happened.
Right. So Marty would also send letters and postcards to Marilyn afterwards. According to Marilyn, about 7 or 8 months after the murders, she received a postcard from Marty that just said Bo is dead, which was not true at all. There was also a letter to Marilyn after the murders, after she had left. She said that she never received it, and the sheriff said that he had never seen it. But it's a pretty interesting letter. They both confirmed that it was Marty's handwriting, but they just didn't say that they saw it.
And
so,
where did the letter?
It was in a filing cabinet in the police department next to that anonymous tape that was closed. Like there was just a lot of things that didn't seem to be researched very well by the police department.
So somebody got the evidence, and then the tape of the person about the skull,
right,
saying that this skull that you found months before is Tina Sharpe. On top of which, this letter from Marilyn, from Marty to Marilyn was in the same evidence box.
Right, but this letter, if it is Marty writing to Marilyn, it says, quote, "I paid a price for your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 lives, you tell me we're through. Great. What else do you want?" End quote. So to say I bought it with 4 lives, and it was a sheriff and Maryland that said it was his handwriting. It wasn't like a handwriting analyst
Right.
or anything like that. But
you'd expect that the person's wife would know what the handwriting
right.
looks like.
But I would also expect a follow-up if that,
at the very least.
Yeah, so Justin Eason, he was staying the night there, and if he saw the murders or if he didn't, I think for a 12-year-old this would have just been a weird traumatic experience no matter what. And he told things to the police right away that made it seem like that he might have saw some stuff, and he was the first to notice that Tina was missing. It just, his stories change over the years and everything, but it just must be the hardest thing for anyone, and especially a 12-year-old, when you don't know if you want to try to please everyone or, trying to say the right things even though they might not be wrong, right? Or
if you're in the middle of the night and you don't know what's going on,
right,
it's possible that if he did see something that was being half asleep and not understanding what was going on, or not necessarily false memories, but like you said, trying to please people.
Right.
They so much is riding on him remembering something.
Yeah.
And him being the oldest there. Of the 3 boys, he's the oldest. So maybe feeling some kind of responsibility for his friends.
Oh, yeah. The police put him under hypnosis on April 13th, which is 2 days after the murder. He had a lot of interesting detail in this. He said that he had a dream and that they were on a boat. He saw a man fighting with Johnny and Dana. The man had a knife and a hammer. Johnny and Dana were then, quote, thrown overboard. He was also saying that there was a crowd that had gathered on the boat, and there was another man dressed just like the man that was fighting with Johnny and Dana. The man that was fighting with Johnny and Dana did say Sue's name, but nobody else's name. He said that he went up to Sue when she was laying on the bow, and he said, quote, "And I looked under the sheet, and there was a slit on the chest," which I guess was correct from the autopsy report. So these are things that he knew. He then said that the crowd started gathering around the body. One thing he did say many times is that he had never seen the men before. So, I mean, if it was his stepdad, like people are saying, you would think that he would recognize him.
Right, and Bo had been living with them
right,
for
and so,
a long enough period that you would think he would recognize 2 people that live in his house. But the idea that the 2 men were dressed alike.
Right, so it was blue jeans, a blue jean jacket. Both had dark sunglasses, and one had short hair and one had longer, like shoulder length hair. And from this hypnosis dream, this is where the wanted sketch came from of the 2 men. So we'll have that on CaliforniaTrueCrime.com also for you to look at. So I decided to watch the episode of The Love Boat that he watched and that Sue had watched that night. And I was hoping maybe there'd be something. I knew nothing about The Love Boat. I had never seen it. You had some, yeah.
I am a very big fan of The Love Boat. It was a huge part of my childhood in the 80s, actually.
Yeah, see, I had never watched it, and I was not impressed, but
it's an acquired taste.
Right, and I should have known right away, like in the first 2 minutes, I was thinking, oh, there might be some guys in blue jeans and a blue jean jacket, and everyone is dressed so nice that I'm like, there's not going to be one person that is dressed in just normal clothes, and no one was thrown overboard. So he incorporated this dream probably because he watched it, but it had nothing to do with the actual episode.
Well, and The Love Boat, from your research, I think, wasn't The Love Boat. It was on at 9 o'clock at night.
Right.
So you figure the boys probably went to bed somewhere in the neighborhood of 9:30, 10 o'clock.
They went to bed right after, and
so 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
So it's an hour show.
And like you were saying, riding bikes all day, they could have been like falling asleep during
Right.
it. But being kids, they want to stay up.
Right. So it's easy to see where that they would incorporate. He would incorporate those kind of things in his, but there's too much detail in the cut on Sue's chest.
Right.
You know, even taking some of the image, you know, we know that Dana, well, not know, but according to what the police photos and the evidence shows, that Dana broke free and they were wrestling, that there's a lot of damage to the boys' heads, and Dana was killed by strangulation.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that's a struggle. That's a fight.
Right.
So it's hard to discount this as just the ramblings of a traumatic 12-year-old.
Right.
But to play the other side, hypnosis is kind of a sketchy thing in that respect too. I would think. I'm not an expert in hypnosis, but it seems that I would be interested to see if the county sheriff had officers interview the children that were experts in interviewing children, that knew how to work with children, that knew what questions to ask. Because I think you're right. Kids want to please adults, and especially those people in authority, and they want to do right. So they might possibly be led astray.
Right. So from all this, that's pretty much where we were left for a long time. Nothing really happened. And then later, way later, there had been some developments in the case. In 2016, a man found a rusty hammer in a pond close to the cabins. What I gathered, it's like that the drought that kind of happened. The pond was a little bit back, so he had a metal detector, and he found it more on like the rim of the pond, and told the police. And it was a rusted hammer that had a blue rubber grip, like with like the little, like if you had a golf club with those little holes
like
on
the
it.
Indentations for grip.
Yeah. A little bit later, a man found a knife in a burn pile roughly in the same area. So
and how far away is that from
the pond? I didn't really get that much information. It just said in the same area.
So probably relatively close.
Yeah, I think being that it's in the resort would be relatively close. So the Plumas County Sheriff's Department has also said that they have about 6 other people they have as suspects, and they know exactly where they are living.
They still haven't made. There's still it's still an open case.
But this was 2016, and then you find nothing more, and it's already 2018. So I don't know if anything has really come about that. And that's pretty much it for Keddie being an unsolved case. I mean, there's a lot of theories that have come about because there's so many people involved in this. So you can have that. Sheila once said that she believes it's Marty that did it because Sue was telling Marilyn that she should leave Marty, and this was one of the theories that were why Marty and Bo were main suspects.
So Marilyn confides in Sue, my husband's abusive, I'm going to leave him, and then Marty finds out about it, gets enraged, gets his friend Bo, and then kills Sue and the entire family.
Yeah, who was maybe like saying, yes, maybe you should leave him.
Right,
yeah.
Like instigating the breakup of Marty's family.
Right. There was also theories that it was because of Dana and Johnny hitchhiking. No one knows if they walked into something or that they might have brought in the guy that picked him up. I mean, because they were hitchhiking.
Right.
It could have just been some crazy or two.
Somebody picks him up.
Yeah.
Takes him into town. They offer, hey, come on in. But they're home. They're home at 9:00, right?
No, not 9. People were still saying they saw him hitchhiking at 11, but they weren't home by the time Love Boat was over and everyone went to bed. It's so fuzzy of what actually went on. But that was one of the theories. And then there's also, if you look at Tina was kidnapped. She was not killed there. Maybe it had something to do with Tina.
She was the only child that was taken away from the place.
Right.
I mean, you still have the 3 boys in the back bedroom alive and left untouched, basically.
Right. She might have woke up.
Right.
A lot of people talk about how can no one hear it, and especially the boys. I think just as children, especially like the 2 boys lived in the room together, they were in the same room. There might have been a lot of noise everywhere. People can start to learn how to sleep through a lot of things.
Right. And the boys have been playing all afternoon.
Right.
So
yeah.
you have 3 friends riding their bikes, playing, enjoying the day. They go in, they're having a sleepover.
They had burritos, heavy burritos.
Right. They enjoy the day. They're going to watch TV with their family. They fall asleep. I mean, I can definitely see that having. Well, I do it myself. You train yourself to kind of fall asleep when ignore things that are going on. Kids are great at that.
Right.
I think to me that's always the biggest sticking point, though, is It's a lot to happen and not. I mean, and again, it goes back to then what Marty's saying about Justin being a light sleeper, though.
Right.
You know, if that's to be taken as fact, and why he wakes up when his father or stepfather stokes the fire,
Mm-hmm.
and that wakes him up on a nightly basis, then why wouldn't a violent occurrence happening not 10 feet away from where he was sleeping, why wouldn't that wake him up?
Right. But that goes to that he might have woke up, and
Right.
then maybe if it was Marty, he just told him to go back into the room.
Right.
He doesn't really want to tell a full story because he's scared of Marty, maybe.
Yeah.
And then the boys, another thing, what if, let's say Sue watches TV and falls asleep on the TV with the TV on? Maybe she listens to it loud. Maybe they just thought it was a TV show
Right.
going. There's so many, it could be anything that why they didn't wake up. But with all this, it's such a brutal murder that no one heard. But there's just so many theories because no one's ever been caught.
And when you talk about the idea that the boys didn't hear anything, I mean, Sheila's 15, 20 feet away
Mm-hmm.
in the next cabin. And the two cabins are so close together. These aren't soundproof buildings.
Right.
I mean, these are, in effect,
They're old cabins.
Yeah. Converted cabins. They're not double pane windows. They're not heavily insulated. I think the fact that they didn't hear anything next door is surprising. It's not unheard of, but it is something that, well, if they didn't hear anything next door, it lends a little more credence to the boys not hearing anything even in the next room.
Right. So as of 2004, not just Cabin 28, a bunch of different cabins, they were just so run down, they were demolished. So it's not there anymore. There's still some cabins at the resort, but that Cabin 28 is gone. Cabin 28 does have a connection in pop culture. There was the movie The Strangers, which you like that movie, right?
I really did. I
Yeah.
did. I am a fan of horror movies, and it was definitely a good horror movie. It was really creepy, and it did its job exceptionally well.
Right. I remember watching it. It's supposedly based on it, but it's not anywhere close.
No,
Right.
I think the director talked about, he's quoted as saying that the idea of a senseless act happening to a family at home, separated from everything else in the middle of nowhere, that being kind of the impetus for because the movie and the Keddie Kicks have really, there's not anything alike. But I know the new Strangers is just coming out. It's like the sequel so many years later, and that's everywhere on the advertisements. It's based on a true story. It's based on a true story.
We looked that up. It was based on it's a different case of a mobile home park.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Charles, for being here again.
Thank you, Sean.
And we will be back really soon. If you would like to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, it's at Cali True Crime. If you would like to see any show notes or pictures from this episode, please visit us at californiatruecrime.com. We also have a Patreon page if you would like to support us. We need to thank our quality control manager, Melanie Duncan. This episode was recorded and produced at Chateau Walnut Studios.